In a world without gunpowder, engines, or modern communication, medieval armies managed to carve out vast empires using only discipline, strategy, and the tools available to them. Castles rose as symbols of control, knights charged into battle clad in steel, and peasants transformed into soldiers through feudal duty. Warfare was not just about brute strength. It was about organization, clever use of terrain, and the ability to sustain campaigns across months and even years. This is the story of how medieval armies, relying on loyalty, faith, and ingenuity, built powerful states and reshaped history without the technologies we take for granted today. Number 1. Origins of medieval power. Feudal power took shape where imperial administration had thinned, and local defense became a daily problem. Authority grew from land, oath, and the ability to mobilize armed men when harvests and weather allowed. A ruler's first asset was not a treasury or an arsenal, but a web of obligations. Lords bound by oath, vassals holding land in return for mounted service, and villagers expected to muster with spear or bow when summoned. This exchange protection for service sat on top of the manorial economy, where surplus grain, grazing rights, and forge work fed the horse, the soldier, and the farrier, who kept both in fighting condition. Mounted shock cavalry, enabled by the stirrup and a culture of horsemanship, became the prestige arm. But prestige did not equal autonomy. It depended on steady support from estates, monasteries, and towns that produced fodder, shoes, mail, and later plate. Power clustered around households rather than ministries. A king's or duke's hall gathered household knights, squires, clerks, and armourers into a standing corps that could march quickly, stiffen a levy, or escort a tax convoy. That household corps gave rulers continuity between seasons and campaigns, while the wider feudal levy expanded numbers when campaigning weather turned favourable. Legal instruments turned muscle into structure. The right to ban men to arms, the counting of knight fees, and later cash commutations like scutage allowed rulers to translate landholding into predictable force or revenue. Coin was never irrelevant. Cash hired specialists, crossbowmen, engineers, guides, and bought provisions when foraging would alienate allies. Castles did not just defend, they mapped authority onto terrain. A chain of fortifications along borders and river crossings created corridors for taxation, safe movement, and wintering troops. Marcher lordships on frontiers, whether along the Elbe in Wales or on the Ebro combined military entrepreneurship with delegated sovereignty, letting ambitious nobles push the frontier while nominally serving the crown. Cities and the church added layers rather than alternatives. Bishops commanded estates and sometimes fielded contingents. Abbeys provisioned armies and minted coin. Urban militias protected gates and markets, while communal loans and tolls financed sieges and bridges. Ideology supplied glue, sacral kingship, and later, penitential warfare framed service as lawful and meritorious, turning musters into moments of public legitimacy. Seasonal realities, sowing, harvest, muddy roads, set the calendar, so planning meant aligning oaths, supplies, and castle storage with the agricultural year. Out of these constraints emerged a repeatable recipe. Concentrate household professionals, levy vassals by clear quotas, secure corridors with castles, supplement with paid specialists, and turn land, oath, and faith into organized violence that could hold ground after the banners came down. Number 2. Weapons and armor without modern tech. The foundation of medieval military power rested on weapons and protective gear that were simple by modern standards, but refined through centuries of craftsmanship and battlefield adaptation. The sword held symbolic value as the weapon of knights and leaders, but in reality, it was not the most common tool of war. Spears dominated the battlefield because they were inexpensive, easy to produce, and deadly both in formation and individual combat. A spear line could stop a cavalry charge when men stood firm, and its length gave even poorly armored infantry a chance against mounted knights. Alongside the spear, polearms evolved. Halberds, glaives, and bills combined reach with cutting edges, giving infantry the versatility to fight cavalry and other foot soldiers alike. Bows and later crossbows were equally important. The longbow, perfected in England, required years of training to master, but could pierce mail and even some plate at long range, creating devastating volleys before melee began. Crossbows, though slower to reload, demanded less training and delivered immense penetrating power, making them valuable in sieges where defenders could hold walls with precision fire. Siege engines magnified this principle. Catapults, mangonels, and trebuchets hurled stones, incendiaries, and diseased carcasses over walls, achieving destructive results without gunpowder. Each of these technologies was based on mechanics, counterweights, and torsion rather than explosives, proving how pre-modern science could still dominate the battlefield. Armor developed in response to these threats. Early reliance on chainmail provided flexibility and decent protection, but as crossbows and heavy swords became widespread, plate elements were added. By the 14th century, full suits of plate armor appeared, crafted to deflect arrows and absorb strikes. Contrary to popular myth, these suits were not impossibly heavy. They allowed knights to mount horses, fight, and even run short distances, though heat and fatigue remained constant challenges. Helmets evolved from simple nasal helms to visored great helms and later bassinets, offering greater visibility and breathing room while still deflecting blows. Shields, too, adapted in shape and size depending on whether they were used in formation, on horseback, or during sieges. Without modern firearms, effectiveness depended on the balance between offense and defense. Weapon makers pushed designs to counter new armor, while armorers responded with stronger alloys and better joint protection. This arms race shaped the appearance of medieval soldiers and defined the rhythm of warfare. Weapons were not just tools. They were reflections of regional resources and traditions. Scandinavian warriors favored axes, Italian militias specialized in crossbows, and English armies relied on longbowmen. These variations showed how geography, economy, and local skills influenced the tools of war. The entire system proved that even without modern technology, disciplined use of crafted steel, wood, and leather could secure victories and expand empires. Number 3. Strategies and tactics. Medieval armies built power not only through weapons and manpower, but also by adapting strategies to the realities of a world without advanced technology. The most basic yet effective method was the shield wall, a formation in which infantry locked shields tightly together, creating a barrier of wood and iron that could withstand cavalry charges and repel waves of attackers. This tactic, inherited from earlier Germanic and Viking traditions, required discipline more than equipment, and its success depended on cohesion rather than individual skill. Cavalry charges represented another cornerstone of medieval battle tactics. Knights, heavily armored and mounted on destriers, delivered shock power designed to break enemy lines. Yet this tactic only succeeded if infantry had already softened the opposition, or if terrain favored the horsemen. When terrain was muddy, forested, or broken, cavalry lost its advantage, which is why commanders carefully chose battlefields that maximized their strengths. Terrain and positioning were themselves decisive tools. Hills gave archers the chance to fire down at advancing enemies, rivers restricted flanking maneuvers, and forests provided cover for ambushes. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 and the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 both highlight how strategic use of ground could allow a smaller force to overcome a larger one. At Agincourt, muddy fields funneled French knights into narrow spaces, where English longbowmen inflicted massive casualties. Here, tactics overcame numerical superiority, showing that medieval warfare was as much about planning as brute strength. Siege tactics became increasingly central, since castles controlled territory more effectively than open field battles. Armies surrounded fortresses, cut supply lines, and applied pressure until defenders surrendered. Siege engines like trebuchets, rams, and towers provided mechanical solutions to walls too strong to breach with manpower alone. Starvation was often as decisive as combat, because long blockades could force capitulation without large-scale bloodshed. The ability to conduct extended sieges reflected organizational strength, as armies needed steady supplies and discipline to remain in the field for months. Flexibility mattered just as much as established strategies. Commanders combined arms by mixing infantry, cavalry, and archers, creating synergy where each group covered the weaknesses of the others. Infantry held formations, cavalry struck weak points, and missile troops weakened enemies before close contact. Diplomacy and deception also played roles. Alliances, feigned retreats, and psychological warfare often determined outcomes. Mongol tactics in Eastern Europe, for example, used rapid cavalry maneuvers and false withdrawals to lure enemies into traps. In Western Europe, the use of banners, drums, and horns allowed commanders to coordinate across chaotic battlefields. What defined medieval strategy was the balance between resource limits and creative adaptation. Without gunpowder, victories depended on disciplined formations, control of terrain, and the patient pressure of sieges. These tactics allowed kingdoms with modest resources to carve out lasting empires, proving that knowledge, organization, and timing could be more decisive than sheer technological advantage. Number 4. Sieges and castles. Warfare in the Middle Ages was shaped more by the struggle for fortifications than by open field clashes, because castles acted as centers of administration, storage, and control over territory. Taking or defending these strongholds meant far more than winning a single battle. It decided who could dominate trade routes, secure farmland, and tax surrounding communities. A medieval castle was not simply a defensive structure, but a symbol of authority, designed with thick stone walls, moats, towers, and gatehouses that forced attackers into predictable killing zones. Defenders used height to their advantage, raining arrows, crossbow bolts, and boiling liquids on anyone approaching the walls. To overcome these obstacles, besieging armies relied on both engineering and patience. The primary method of siege warfare was encirclement, cutting off supplies and waiting until hunger or disease forced surrender. Starvation was often more reliable than direct assault, since stone walls resisted most attacks. However, rulers with resources invested in siege engines. The trebuchet, perfected in the High Middle Ages, used counterweight mechanics to hurl massive stones that could break sections of wall or create chaos within the defenses. Battering rams protected by wooden coverings targeted gates, while siege towers allowed attackers to climb over walls while under some protection. Miners also played a role, digging tunnels beneath walls to collapse foundations, though this demanded time and risked countermining by defenders. Each of these methods required not only technical skill, but also coordination, because a prolonged siege could stretch for months or even years. Logistics determined success as much as weapons. Armies needed food, water, and shelter to wait out a siege, and commanders had to secure these resources from surrounding territories. Some sieges became infamous for their length, like the nearly year-long siege of Antioch during the First Crusade, or the long struggles for French castles during the 100 Years' War. In these campaigns, psychological pressure was as decisive as engineering. The sight of giant trebuchets assembling outside the walls, or the knowledge that no reinforcements were coming, often broke defenders before the walls themselves fell. Castles evolved in response to these threats. Early motte and bailey wooden fortifications gave way to stone keeps, concentric walls, and improved gatehouses with portcullises and murder holes. As siege tactics advanced, so did defensive architecture, leading to a constant arms race between attackers and builders. The presence of a castle could stabilize a frontier, anchor a lord's power, and provide a refuge during invasion. Controlling castles meant controlling regions, which is why medieval rulers poured immense resources into building, garrisoning, and upgrading them. In the absence of modern artillery or explosives, this dynamic of siege and fortification shaped the pace of expansion and defined how medieval armies built and maintained empires. Number 5. Campaigns and crusades. Medieval campaigns were shaped by the limits of pre-modern logistics, seasonal rhythms, and the political structures of feudal Europe, yet they still managed to extend armies across continents. Campaigns began with musters, where vassals assembled with their contingents, often timed after harvest, so that men could leave their fields. Armies typically moved along river valleys and established roads, since large groups of men and animals consumed massive amounts of food and water each day. Supply was the greatest challenge. A medieval host might number 10 to 30,000, and each soldier required daily rations of bread, meat, and ale. while horses consumed far more fodder than humans could ever carry. This meant armies either arranged convoys from allied regions or, more often, lived off the land, sometimes devastating local populations in the process. Campaigning was therefore inseparable from economics, since the ability to feed men determined how far and how long an army could operate. Crusading warfare amplified these pressures. The First Crusade, beginning in 1096, drew thousands of knights, infantry, and non-combatants from across Western Europe into Byzantine and Islamic lands. Without maps, modern communications, or stable supply systems, these forces relied on local agreements, plunder, and the support of religious institutions to survive. Despite starvation and disease, they captured key strongholds like Antioch and Jerusalem, proving that determined logistics and ideological motivation could move armies thousands of kilometers. Later crusades became more structured, with kings like Richard the Lionheart organizing fleets and contracts for provisions, showing the gradual professionalization of long-distance campaigns. Even so, attrition was constant. Disease, desertion, and lack of resources often killed more men than battle. Within Europe, campaigns against neighboring kingdoms or rebellious vassals showed similar patterns. Marching armies aimed to avoid prolonged battles unless the conditions were favorable, because one defeat could unravel months of preparation. Raiding enemy territory to burn crops and villages, known as chevauchée in France, was a way to pressure rulers economically and politically without risking pitched battle. Campaigns in frontier regions like Iberia during the Reconquista or Eastern Europe during the expansion of Christian states revealed the blend of settlement, castle building, and military presence that gradually turned conquest into permanent control. Crusades and extended campaigns reshaped not only military practices, but also society. They encouraged the rise of military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers, organizations that combined monastic discipline with knightly warfare, providing more reliable forces than seasonal levies. They also intensified connections between warfare and ideology, where the promise of spiritual reward justified hardships that would otherwise have seemed impossible. Campaigns, whether local or global in scope, demonstrated that medieval armies, though bound by limited technology, could use organization, faith, and resource management to build empires and change the map of Europe and the Near East. Number 6. Legacy of medieval warfare. The legacy of medieval warfare is not limited to the images of knights in shining armor or the grand castles that still dominate European landscapes. It lies in the institutional, cultural, and technological foundations that shaped the development of later states and armies. One of the most enduring contributions was the evolution of military organization. The feudal levy, which initially tied military service to landholding, gradually gave way to professionalized and permanent forces. Monarchs realized that relying on seasonal obligations limited their power, so the steady use of mercenaries and the emergence of paid standing troops created a model for centralized armies that could act independently of noble loyalties. This shift marked a transition towards the modern state, where taxation systems, royal treasuries, and bureaucracies emerged to maintain forces year-round. The interplay between weapons and armor left another long-lasting impact. The arms race between offensive and defensive technology spurred metallurgical advances, forging techniques, and new engineering methods that influenced not only warfare, but also crafts and industry. Techniques developed in armories, such as tempering steel or shaping plate armor, fed into civilian blacksmithing and construction. Likewise, siege warfare left behind more than broken walls. It stimulated architectural innovation. Concentric fortifications, metifications, and stronger masonry were direct responses to centuries of trial and error under siege conditions. These innovations influenced later urban planning, as walled cities became the prototypes of fortified early modern capitals. Medieval campaigns also transformed logistics and administration. The challenge of feeding and supplying thousands of men across long distances forced rulers to build more efficient taxation, accounting, and record-keeping systems. From the English exchequer rolls to continental muster lists, the paperwork of war helped create stronger governments. This administrative heritage linked military necessity with the rise of centralized monarchies. The Crusades added an international dimension, connecting Europe with the Near East, accelerating trade, and transmitting ideas, from new fortification styles to medical practices. These campaigns also revealed the importance of ideology in mobilizing masses, as religion provided the justification for unprecedented levels of collective action. The notion of a shared cause, transcending local feudal ties, foreshadowed the national and ideological wars of later centuries. The human legacy cannot be overlooked. The chivalric code, while romanticized, framed martial behavior around ideals of loyalty, honor, and service, values that persisted in later military traditions. The experience of common soldiers, who fought not for chivalry, but for survival and opportunity, laid the groundwork for the recognition of infantry as decisive forces, a principle carried into early modern pike and shot formations. Medieval warfare showed that empires could be built without modern technology through discipline, organization, and adaptation. Its structures, innovations, and cultural frameworks bridged the world of antiquity and the emerging modern order, leaving behind institutions and traditions that still shape how societies organize power and conflict today.